Welcome to the Crypto Teacher. And guys, I come with that video just to make you think. And we had Steve Mnuchin yesterday testifying again. And of course, the question was about the repos closing and then also the $700 million YRC loan. Now, basically, that also is connected to Apollo, which Apollo is connected to Jared Kushner, which they actually loaned Jared Kushner $184 million on a family real estate company. So basically, in this video, you'll hear Steve Mnuchin say he was urged by Congress to make this loan. Also, guys, as you hear also in this video, you're going to hear Representative Toomey say the economy has recovered. You're going to hear Steve Mnuchin saying the economy has recovered. Me personally, the repos have only helped the corporations. So the repos definitely haven't helped the people. But the fact is, if you're an investor, if you invest in the stock market, yes, we benefited. We benefited on the stock market. We benefited on cryptos. But the masses have not benefited. Now, we know once they start shrinking liquidity, the masses are going to be hurt even more. Because we know that the actual small businesses have closed, but we're also going to see large corporations start to lay off at the beginning of the year. Remember, I told you that. But you guys enjoyed the video. Remember, everything the New World Order does is already planned out. You have a wonderful day.
Despite the Secretary's claims, the CARES Act did not require him to end the programs this year. The Secretary admits as much when he says he based his decision not on what the law actually says, but on his interpretation of Congress's intent. In quite the coincidence, the Secretary decided that this is what Congress intended only after the election of Joe Biden. Before the election, the Treasury's position was that it could extend the programs if market conditions required it. This was a political decision, one intended to hamstring the incoming administration even as COVID deaths are spiking and the economic recovery is slowing. Let me put it this way. Does anyone think the Treasury would have ended these programs if Donald Trump was reelected? Thankfully, the Biden administration is not bound by the Secretary's decision. The new administration can, and in my view should, restart the programs, reclaim the money Congress has set aside in the CARES Act, and use it to offer more help to small businesses and state and local governments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to add my deep disappointment in your recent decision to terminate these emergency lending programs. I understand that you interpret the statute to mean that Congress intended to terminate the programs on December 31st. But certainly we did not intend for you to prematurely claw back the funds. Treasury is already committed to investing in the programs at a time when American small businesses, cities, states, and workers are still struggling desperately. If the Main Street and municipal lending programs are underutilized, it's because the terms were too stringent, not because there wasn't a need. Keeping these facilities open was projected to cost taxpayers virtually nothing, while closing them puts up a roadblock for the next Treasury Secretary to get our economy back on track. This decision is especially concerning when contrasted with your generosity in the National Security Loan Program, in particular the $700 million YRC loan, which does put taxpayers at a real risk of loss. I look forward to hearing from you.
Brief facilities? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Let me refer you to the CARES Act. And there are three provisions of the CARES Act that work together. And Senator Toomey, as you know, you recall this because you and I were in the room and we actually drafted this. Senator Crapo was with me as well. I sat with Senator Crapo right outside Senator Schumer's office with Senator Schumer's staff very late that night, going through line by line. So the first part is Section 4029, which everybody can look at, has a December 31st, 2020 date. Obviously, there was some relevance or there would not have been the point of putting in. It's very clear, except as provided under B, on December 1st, 2020, the authority to make new loans shall terminate. It also references 4027. So under 4027, what it says is that if there are existing loans outstanding, we can continue to make advances under existing loans. And then the final part I would just comment, okay, there is a provision that when the money comes back on the waterfall, how it works. I've made no judgment as to whether it goes into the ESF or whether it goes into the general fund. Matter of fact, a lot of it will stay in the ESF as unused funds. For people who think there's another interpretation, the only logical thing is that 4029 doesn't apply to indirect commitments as well as direct commitments, and would imply that money I've put in the Fed, if it were just sitting there, could be used. That was not the intent that you and I discussed. It's not in the law, and if Congress wants to reallocate this money for the Fed, instead of reallocating it for unemployment and PPP loans and others, Congress can do that now. Thank you, Mr. Senator.
Thank you. The lending programs in January, but that amendment didn't pass. And so I think I'll just leave it there instead of going back and forth on this. So Mr. Secretary, in the CARES Act, Congress gave you the authority to make direct loans to companies critical to national security. By far the biggest loan you have made, for $700 million, or 70 times larger than the next largest loan, is to a trucking company called YRC, which helps the Defense Department ship basic supplies between military bases. So I'm glad that this loan has helped put off job losses and healthcare cuts and retirement cuts for truckers. But it wasn't just the company's workers that benefited from this loan. The company's creditors on Wall Street made out great too. And so I want to dig into why you chose to give such a big and generous loan to this specific company, a company that this commission has said has a weak connection to national security. So at the time that you made this loan to YRC in July, were you aware that Apollo Global Management, a big private equity firm, was YRC's biggest creditor with as much as $600 million at stake?
Yes, I was, but I just want to state for the record, okay, I have consulted with my general counsel. My general counsel agrees with our reading of the 13.3, and if a future Treasury Department wants to break the law and have a different interpretation, Congress will deal with that.
Just on that point, Secretary Mnuchin.
In all due respect, you are not the person who I'm relying upon for legal advice. I have a legal department that I've relied upon, and we are following the law.
I appreciate that. And just to turn back to these questions, but quickly, is that a written memo that the General Counsel provided to you on this topic?
He's provided me verbal advice, and we are going to follow it up with a memo. And if the commission would like it, once the memo is complete, we're more than happy to.
Yes, I think we'd all agree that that would be a useful thing to have. Okay, so back to the question. You were aware that Apollo was YRC's biggest creditor, and you also knew, according to written responses that the Treasury has provided to this commission, that YRC was likely to file for bankruptcy if it didn't receive a loan from the government.
Yes, I was aware of that.
And YRC going through bankruptcy would have potentially cost Apollo hundreds of millions of dollars. But
that I was not aware of. That's subjective. Sure. I never did that analysis.
Okay. But
I think it wouldn't have cost them, but I do think it would have been bankrupt and the company would have fired
Sure.
lots of people.
So, Apollo got lucky because not only did you give YRC a loan, you gave them a great deal, as the commission has concluded, on a bipartisan basis. In fact, even though taxpayers are ponying up $700 million, Apollo, not American taxpayers, gets the first claim on YRC's existing assets if it goes bankrupt. Is that right?
So would you like me to give our analysis on why we made the loan?
No, I just simply want to answer the question about, does Apollo retain first priority on YRC's
certain
existing
assets it does, and in certain assets we have a first priority lien. So
only on assets that are purchased using the Treasury loan.
Again, there's a term A and there's a term B, and there's different collateral. We'd be happy to go through the detailed analysis with you. You can see I brought plenty of information. I tried to, didn't realize Representative Hill was going to have as much as well. I wanted to be prepared.
Okay, I appreciate that. So the answer sounds like yes, that on most of the assets that exist now, Apollo retains first priority. And there are other signs of special treatment. According to a GAO report released this morning, Treasury, quote, did not follow the standard process established for evaluating applications for the YRC loan. The GAO found that Treasury fast-tracked YRC's application even though, quote, Treasury did not fast-track any other applications, though other businesses faced similar circumstances. So again, we have a fast-tracked, extremely generous loan that just so happened to help the private equity giant Apollo. So, Mr. Secretary, were you aware before you made this loan that Apollo has close personal ties to Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor?
So let me submit for the record a letter from Peter DeFazio and Sam Graves. Okay, let me also submit for the record a letter from Rod Wyden and Pat Roberts. I have many other letters that I'd be more than happy to submit afterwards. But let me just say we had tremendous interest from Congress asking us to expedite this. We also had a certification from the Department of Defense that the loan qualified. So, of course, we were going to prioritize this because, as you said, there was a tremendous risk to the Department of Defense and a tremendous risk to the number of jobs.
So, Mr. Secretary, I understand all of that, but my question was, were you aware at the time that you made this loan that Apollo has close ties to Jared Kushner?
When you say close ties, what's the definition of close ties?
Were you aware that in 2017, Apollo loaned the Kushner companies $184 million?
I was not aware of that.
You weren't aware of that, which was reported in the New York Times and the
I may have read
CNBC?
it in the press at some point, but I'm not involved, nor did I take that in consideration. Nor prior to you asking me that would I have known that.
Sorry, just, Mr. Chairman, briefly to finish up here. Mr. Secretary, can I just ask for, on the record, did Mr. Kushner or anyone from his staff ever reach out to you about providing a loan to YRC?
He or nobody on his staff ever reached out to me.
And so,
Thank you. We'll have another round.
Because that doesn't exist.
okay, the White House more broadly, however?
I consult with our legal department.
Thanks.
I think, as you know, we have certain privileged
Sure.
things with the White House.
I understand, but thank you for taking a look at that, and we'll follow up on that. Look, I think at best, this is a loan, as some of my colleagues have said, that puts nearly $1 billion of public money at risk with minimal protections, and that helps a private equity giant that was sitting on billions of dollars of its own money. And at worst, I think this generous loan was rushed into place to benefit a firm with close personal ties to the president's family, and I think that this warrants further investigation by this commission. So I want to take a look at some of the national security loans other than the YRC loan. Of course, none of them are nearly as big as the $700 million loan to YRC, but the GAO report that came out this morning raises some concerns about the process. So as you know,
quote, publicly traded trucking company, YRC, will ask for $1 billion in aid from the federal bailout fund, close quote. Shares of YRC have, quote, plummeted, close quote. Those sound familiar, and they might sound like they're from a post-CARES Act headline, but they're actually from the Associated Press, May 15th, 2009. Later that year, banks and investment banks were compelled to do a debt-for-equity swap with YRC, led by their union, Jimmy Hoffa, speaking on behalf of organized labor, pressing them, saying that he was successful in getting this done in Washington. When you were reviewing this credit application, were you aware of this debt-for-equity swap and the trouble YRC had at the end of the financial crisis?
I believe the team was. I was not specifically aware of that.
So in addition to the valuation questions on the collateral pool I talked about, I wondered if the team had had conversations with the other senior creditors for Tranche A on a different sharing arrangement before you agreed to the terms.
I can tell you, we obviously had discussions with other creditors because we needed inter-creditor agreements and other issues. I personally don't recall any of those conversations. Adam Larrick, who led the team, was here and can follow up with your office. And again, let me just reiterate, Representative Hill and others, this was a risky loan. We've been fortunate that the economy recovered and that the equity is doing well. And I am going to recommend that next year, whoever is Treasury Secretary seriously look at selling this loan and recovering what I think will be a profit to taxpayers, because this was a success, but we do not want to be in the long-term business of lending to this type of company or any of the national security companies. But fortunately, we've made a significant profit, and taxpayers should get paid back.
Well, I appreciate that. And we'll be having a meeting, the commission will, next week with the Department of Defense, because the whole issue, when you look at this underwriting situation, you have to ask yourself, why did the Pentagon get dependent through its prime contractor, Crowley, for 68% of its less than truckload needs on a company that was essentially near bankruptcy and has been in, as I say, junk financial condition for 20 years? I find that not a Treasury question here, and I respect that, But certainly a question that this commission will be interested in when we meet with the Treasury Department on why the DOD would be so dependent on such a weak company when there are many companies, including union companies, for my friends on the other side of the aisle, that have tremendous financial strength that provide LTL.
Chair Toomey, I'd be happy, since it's such a small group today, to take a third round of questions. I want to make sure that the committee has as much time for oversight as is needed for us to be able to answer whatever there is today.
Yeah, I'm reclaiming my time. I just want to, I want to make sure that I understand, because we need to learn from your experience with these loans. What would you do differently in the national security program in particular that you would recommend to us that should be included in legislation, for example, so that we don't get a YRC in the future?
Well, again, you're assuming we shouldn't get a YRC in the future. You know, as I've said, there are plenty of people who are very senior people in Congress on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, that encouraged me. I'm actually quite proud of the fact that we did YRC. It saved lots and lots and lots of jobs. And I can tell you I've received calls from the company, from truckers, from other people who really appreciate this. So
I hear that from my Republican colleagues all the time.
You acknowledge it would be a loophole?
No, I don't. I hardly think it's a loophole. I think it makes complete sense for Congress to create a program that says...
Well, why, if there's a December, then what was the intent of the December 31st?
Sure, I'll explain what I think is a reasonable interpretation of the statute. As of December 31st, the Treasury Department cannot create new facilities with this money that was allocated by Congress. Separately, Congress said in the very same statute that the money remains with the Treasury Department until 2026, at which point it goes back to the general fund, which to me indicates an intent of Congress that the money should remain available to the Treasury Department up till 2026, which to me contemplates this program existing well past 2021. That is in the statute. And I think that if you look at the Fed's response to your letter asking for the money back, it's quite clear that they don't agree with your interpretation of the statute either. They are deferring to it, but they said that if it was up to them, they would extend these facilities. So I know I'm over my time, but that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Senator Toomey, can I just make one
Secretary
comment?
Mnuchin.
I just want to correct the record, and you can speak to Chair Powell or the Fed, but since I speak to him all the time, and we've spoken, what the Fed has said, okay, the Fed has not said that's their interpretation of the legal view. What the Fed has said is that if there were no restriction, as a general matter, they like to leave facilities outstanding. And that's why, as deferential to the Fed, the facilities that used pre-CARES Act money were extended. And obviously, if this was politically motivated, why would I have extended any facilities?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me comment on this discussion briefly. First of all, I think the alternative interpretation of the statute that Commissioner Ramamurti has articulated is not the correct interpretation at all. And I do think it is important to point out that it would necessarily lead to an absurd outcome. Absurd in the context of the clear fact that the entire purpose of this facility was to solve an immediate credit liquidity crisis, not to provide an ongoing multi-year set of tools for the Fed to decide whom to subsidize in the future.